In May of 1943, a transport convoy entered Boston Harbor. On board was a cargo marked as highly dangerous. 3,000 soldiers of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite, men who had spent years fighting in the desert and considered themselves invincible. But the moment the ship docked, something happened that wasn't written in any military manual. Europe, from where they had come, lived in a state of total darkness. The blackout. Any beam of light at night was an invitation for a bomber. These soldiers were used to cities being dark, gloomy ghosts. Their propaganda, Dr. Goebbels personally, had assured them, New York and Boston lie in ruins. The Luftwaffe has destroyed America. Their economy is dead. And then the ship touches the pier. It is night. And suddenly the lights turn on. Not searchlights. The entire city. The skyscrapers of Manhattan and Boston glowed with millions of windows. Street lamps burned so brightly that you could read a newspaper on the deck. Neon signs flashed. Cars drove with their headlights on. For an American dock worker on the pier, it was just a Tuesday. For the German prisoners on the deck, it was a psychological strike comparable to carpet bombing. They stood at the railings, staring at the glowing horizon in total silence. In that moment, before even setting foot on American soil, they realized they had been lied to. America wasn't just unafraid of air raids. It didn't even bother turning off the lights. This was the beginning of the most massive re-education by reality program in the history of warfare. The U.S. accepted 371,000 German prisoners of war, and instead of breaking their bones in basements, Uncle Sam decided to break their worldview. The reception on the shore only intensified this surrealism. The prisoners were met not by firing squads, but by lazy longshoremen and police officers. Americans chewed gum, smoked cigarettes, and looked at the supermen with mild indifference. No hatred, just a job. Then the loading began. The German officers expected to be herded into cattle cars, dirty wagons without windows, the standard for military logistics of the time. Instead, the doors of passenger trains were opened before them. Soft seats, clean glass, conductors in uniform. Diary entries from those days have survived. Wehrmacht soldiers were convinced this was a trick. A Potemkin village. They whispered among themselves, "We are being taken to a public execution. That is why they are giving us this final comfort." Or, "These cars are being driven in circles to create an illusion of wealth." They pressed themselves against the windows, peering into the darkness beyond the glass. They looked for craters. They looked for ruins. They looked for any confirmation that America was suffering from the war, just as Germany was. But the train picked up speed, taking them deeper into the continent, and outside the window, a picture unfolded that frightened them more than the sight of an enemy tank. To understand the level of cognitive dissonance these men experienced, you have to know exactly what the Nazi propaganda machine had been pouring into their ears since 1939. For the average Wehrmacht soldier raised under Hitler, America wasn't just an enemy. It was a caricature. Joseph Goebbels was a master of lies, but in the case of the U.S., he outdid himself. German newspapers and newsreels depicted Americans as a collection of gangsters and cowboys. They were told that the U.S. Army was an undisciplined mob commanded by Jews and bankers who had no concept of military honor. But the biggest lie concerned the destruction. When the Luftwaffe bombed London, German radio reported that the next target was New York. Soldiers on the Eastern Front were shown fake photos of a smoking Manhattan. They were told that the Statue of Liberty is no more, that the Capitol in Washington lay in ruins. They were indoctrinated with the idea that American industry was paralyzed by strikes and racial riots. Imagine Hans or Fritz, who believes this like scripture. He is certain that America is a colossus with feet of clay that will collapse from a single kick. And then this Hans finds himself on a train, traveling through Pennsylvania or Ohio. He presses his forehead against the glass. He sees farms where there are more tractors than in all of his native Bavaria. He sees cities where people walk calmly down the streets, dressed in good clothes. No bread lines, no ration cards. The prisoners' psychological defense mechanisms went into overdrive. They went into denial. It is a documented fact. Many prisoners seriously believed that the view outside the train window was special effects. A guard at a camp in Mississippi recalled an incident where a group of prisoners refused to get out of a truck in town. They claimed the houses around them were cardboard sets built by Hollywood to break their spirit. One German officer even walked up to the brick wall of a store and started punching it, trying to punch through the cardboard. He bloodying his knuckles. The wall was real. They looked for confirmation that they were right, but found only new evidence of their defeat. They saw cars. In Germany, a personal car was a luxury available only to the party elite. In America of the 40s, cars were parked at every diner. Ordinary workers drove to their shifts in their own Fords and Chevrolets. For a German soldier who had walked or ridden in a horse-drawn cart for most of the war, this looked like science fiction. Goebbels told them that Americans were cultural barbarians, but these barbarians somehow lived in houses with central heating, refrigerators, and radios. Propaganda painted a picture of a dying, weak nation. Reality slapped them in the face with every billboard they saw, every full tank of gas. And the further the train went west, the more obvious one terrible truth became. For a European, distance is a compact concept. You get on a train in Berlin, and 6 hours later you can be in Prague or Warsaw. Borders in Europe are tight. Countries pile up on top of each other. Hitler's entire war was based on the idea of blitzkrieg, lightning war. A quick dash, seize territory, victory. But America is not a country. It is a continent disguised as a country. Trains carrying POWs went from East Coast ports deep into the interior, to camps in Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Arizona. And this trip became a geography lesson for the Germans that scared them to their core. Day turned to night. Night turned to day. And outside the window, it was still the same country. A Luftwaffe lieutenant recalled looking at a map and not believing his eyes. They had been traveling for 20 hours, but on the map, their train had crawled only a tiny segment. He asked the guard, "Are we in Canada yet?" The guard laughed and replied, "Son, we haven't even left Pennsylvania." In that moment, a monstrous strategic truth began to dawn on the prisoners. Germany was trying to fight a state that possessed infinite strategic depth. Even if Hitler had miraculously managed to land troops in New York, even if they had captured Washington, they would have had to march another 3,000 miles of those same endless fields, forests, and mountains to reach the other ocean. It was a war against geography itself, and geography was winning. But the scariest thing wasn't the distance. The scariest thing was the tranquility of the landscape. In Europe in 1943, there was no safe place. The sky everywhere held a threat. Any train could be strafed by attack aircraft. Any city could turn into ruins in a single night. Here, in the American heartland, there was a deafening peace. The train clattered rhythmically on the rails, soothingly. Farms floated by where cows lazily chewed grass. Small towns with white picket fences. Children waving at the train. Not a single crater. Not a single destroyed bridge. No signs of war. The prisoners pressed against the glass, and a silent question could be read in their eyes. How can we defeat a people who live so far from the war that they don't even hear its sounds? For a soldier whose homeland was burning in the fires of bombing raids, the sight of this untouched virgin land was proof of their doom. America was a giant fortress surrounded by two oceans, and the walls of this fortress were too high. And the further south and west the trains went, the more the landscape changed. Forests gave way to endless fields of corn and wheat. oceans of gold stretching to the horizon. And then they realized one more thing. These endless expanses weren't just emptiness. It was a factory. A factory that produced the resource that had become Germany's #1 deficit. When the camp gates slammed shut, the prisoners prepared for the worst. In their understanding, captivity meant starvation. In Soviet camps, prisoners died of exhaustion. In Germany itself, rations for prisoners consisted of gruel and a piece of bread with sawdust added for weight. But in the American camp, the first thing that hit them was the smell. Not the smell of carbolic acid or sewage. It was the smell of frying bacon, fresh coffee, and scrambled eggs. America strictly followed the 1929 Geneva Convention. According to the rules, prisoners of war must receive the same rations as the rear units of the army that captured them. And the rear units of the U.S. Army in the 40s ate better than the kings of Europe. Wehrmacht soldiers walked into the mess hall, grabbed trays, and froze in a stupor. Before them were mountains of mashed potatoes, steaks, vegetables, white bread, real butter, and dessert, ice cream or fruit pie. For a man who had been eating ersatz products and turnip preserves for the last 2 years, this looked like a hallucination. Many refused to eat. They sat before full plates, afraid to touch their forks. Why? Because paranoia kicked in. Rumors spread through the camps. The most fanatical Nazis assured the others, "Don't eat this. It's a trick. They are fattening us up before execution, like pigs before Christmas. No one feeds an enemy meat for no reason." It was a logical thought for a person from a world of scarcity. In Nazi ideology, resources are a zero-sum game. If you give someone food, you take it away from your own people. The idea that there could be too much food simply didn't fit in their heads. But days passed. There were no executions. There was only breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks. The prisoners began to gain weight. On average, a German soldier gained from 6 to 10 pounds in the first months of captivity. They saw peanut butter, ketchup, and Coca-Cola for the first time. They tried cornflakes and couldn't understand why Americans ate them for breakfast. But the hardest hit came during the holidays. On Thanksgiving, camp commandants ordered traditional turkey with cranberry sauce to be served. Imagine the scene. Thousands of enemy soldiers sitting at tables in Texas, eating a holiday dinner, unable to understand. What for? This abundance broke their will to resist more effectively than torture. Torture causes anger and a desire for revenge. Satiety causes apathy and questions. Soldiers started writing letters home. "Dear Mom, they give meat here every day. Yesterday, I drank beer." American censorship, surprisingly, often didn't let these letters through. Not because of secrecy, but because they were afraid that families in Germany would think the soldiers were insane or traitors who had sold out for a piece of sausage. No one in destroyed Hamburg would have believed such a menu. It was the greatest flex in the history of warfare. America was essentially saying, "Look, we are fighting a war on 2 oceans. We are supplying Britain and the USSR. And we still have so many resources that we can feed you, our enemies, better than your Führer feeds his generals." It was humiliating. It showed them their place in the food chain of this war. They were representatives of a nation that counted every gram of copper and grain, and they had ended up in a country that could afford to throw away leftovers. But this food didn't fall from the sky. Behind every steak and every can of food stood an invisible force. A system that ground up the planet's resources with frightening speed. And soon, the prisoners were to see the heart of the system. Guns, tanks, and planes don't grow on trees. Factories make them. And in the 40s, America turned into a giant factory that stamped out instruments of war with unprecedented speed. This phenomenon was called the arsenal of democracy. To show the prisoners what they were dealing with, American authorities organized field trips for them. They took them to factories. and it was an experience that changed them forever. The most famous example was the Willow Run plant near Detroit. It was a giant complex built by Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. The plant covered an area of 3.5 million square feet, more than several football fields put together. The prisoners were led inside, and they were lost. They walked along a conveyor belt where hundreds of workers were assembling bomber after bomber. Every hour, a new B-24 rolled off the line, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. While Hitler was giving one fiery speech, the Willow Run plant produced 40 bombers. The math of war was ruthless. German soldiers, who had only seen war in trenches and battlefields, encountered industrial might for the first time. They saw thousands of people performing monotonous tasks. They saw machines stamping parts with millimeter precision. They saw logistics that allowed the factory to run like a clock. One prisoner, a former engineer, said after the tour, "Now I understand why we lost. We were fighting against machines, and they have more machines than people." But it wasn't just about quantity. It was about organization. Women worked at the factories. While men fought at the front, their wives and daughters turned bolts, riveted fuselages, and painted planes. It was total resource mobilization. In Germany, women also worked in factories, but on a much smaller scale. The Nazis believed a woman's place was at home, with children. Americans didn't care about gender prejudices. They needed working hands. All hands. The prisoners saw African Americans working side by side with whites. For soldiers raised in racist ideology, this was a shock. The Nazis considered Africans subhuman. In America, these subhumans were building the bombers that would destroy the Reich. American industry didn't just produce weapons. It destroyed Nazi myths. Another mandatory stop on the re-education program was the shipyards. There, prisoners were shown how Liberty ships were built, cargo vessels that transported troops and supplies across the Atlantic. Nazi submariners sank these ships by the thousands, but Americans built new ones faster than the Germans could sink them. One Liberty ship came off the slipway every 42 days. The prisoners stood and watched welders assemble the ship's hull from steel plates. They saw cranes lift huge sections and set them in place. They smelled the metal and machine oil. They realized that this was an unstoppable force. One prisoner said, "We thought we were fighting against a country, but we were fighting against a conveyor belt, and you cannot defeat a conveyor belt." These tours were designed to break the prisoners' will to resist, and they worked. Many soldiers fell into depression after visiting the factories. They realized Germany had no chance in this war, but admitting defeat wasn't easy. Nazi ideology had soaked through their consciousness, and in the camps, another battle began. A civil war between those who understood the truth and those who refused to believe it. When the sun went down over the camps in Arizona or Texas, American jurisdiction ended. Beyond the barbed wire lay the territory of the Third Reich. U.S. authorities made one fatal mistake. Following the Geneva Convention, they allowed prisoners to maintain their military hierarchy. Officers commanded soldiers. Non-commissioned officers maintained discipline. The Americans liked it. The camps were clean, beds were made, prisoners marched to lunch. Order. But the Americans didn't understand who was really running these men. Among the hundreds of thousands of prisoners were fanatics, SS members, party veterans, ideologically pure Nazis. They quickly seized power inside the barracks. They created what was later called the Invisible Gestapo. Imagine the situation. You are a simple German draftee named Hans. You've seen the Ford factories. You've eaten American steaks. You realize the war is lost. In the evening, sitting on your bunk, you say to a comrade, "You know, Hitler lied to us. America will win." That phrase was enough to sign your own death warrant. At night, men would come to your bunk. They would wake you in a whisper. "The Femme Gerichte," a secret court of honor, would begin. You were accused of defeatism and treason against the Führer. These courts had no lawyers, only a verdict. The execution of punishment was brutal and inventive. The fanatics knew that American guards investigated murders, so they disguised executions as accidents or suicides. It was called the Holy Ghost. Groups of killers would strangle a victim in their sleep, leaving no marks. Or they would corner a man, give him a rope, and say, "You have a choice. Either you hang yourself right now, or we will find your family in Hamburg. And something very bad will happen to them." And the man would climb into the noose. An atmosphere of total paranoia reigned in the camps. Prisoners were afraid to speak English. They were afraid to read American newspapers. They were afraid to throw away food so as not to be accused of sympathizing with the enemy. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, an incident occurred that shocked even hardened Rangers. Corporal Johannes Kunze passed information to the Americans about other prisoners. The fanatics found out. They beat him to death with heavy bowls from the mess hall. 200 people watched. No one intervened. The American administration turned a blind eye to this for a long time. It was convenient for them that the Nazis regulated themselves. It was a lazy policy of non-intervention that cost the lives of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of German soldiers who just wanted to survive the war. The scariest part was that this was happening in the center of the land of the free. While outside the fence, farmers listened to jazz and discussed baseball, inside the barracks, medieval laws applied. The swastika was banned, but it was branded into the minds of the barrack leaders. They terrorized their own, forcing them to believe in a victory that could not be. They forced them to hate the very hand that fed them. But fanaticism is a fuel that burns out quickly without replenishment. The Americans found a way to destroy the power of the invisible Gestapo. The method was capitalist, cynical, and brilliant. They offered the prisoners jobs and money. By 1944, America faced a crisis that neither bombers nor tanks could solve. The country had run out of men. Everyone capable of holding a weapon was in Europe or the Pacific. And in the fields of the Midwest and the South, the harvest was rotting. There was no one to pick corn in Nebraska, cotton in Mississippi, or tomatoes in Indiana. The arsenal of democracy could produce thousands of tanks, but it risked going hungry. The solution was found behind barbed wire. The U.S. government launched a labor mobilization program for POWs. It was a brilliant move. 300,000 healthy, disciplined men who were sitting idle were sent to the fields. But this wasn't slavery in the Nazi sense. Hitler used the slave labor of Ostarbeiters, working them to death. Uncle Sam acted like a true capitalist. He offered a deal. Prisoners received 80 cents a day. Not in cash, but in coupons that could be spent at the camp store. With these coupons, one could buy cigarettes, chocolate, beer, and even toiletries. For a German soldier, 80 cents a day was a fortune, and they went to work. Thousands of Germans went out into the fields of Iowa, Kansas, and Minnesota. And here, under the scorching sun, a strange chemistry occurred. Propaganda began to dissolve in the sweat of labor. American farmers were initially afraid of them. They hid their daughters and kept their shotguns loaded. They expected to see monsters with horns, as the newspapers wrote. Instead, they saw ordinary farm boys who knew how to handle a tractor and how to milk a cow. Hans from Bavaria found common ground with John from Kansas faster than any diplomats could. The land united them. Rules forbade fraternization. But in endless fields, you can't keep track of everyone. By noon, the guard, often consisting of a single board soldier, would fall asleep in the shade of a tree, and the farmer would invite the prisoners for lunch. There is a scene that was repeated in thousands of American homes, and which perfectly describes the surrealism of that war. Imagine a farmhouse kitchen. At the table sits the farmer's family and 2 German prisoners. The hostess serves them stew. They pray before the meal. The farmer looks at the young German and sees a peer of his own son. His son is somewhere in France right now, in a trench. Maybe he is aiming at this German's brother. But here, at this table, they are just men tired after work. They pass each other the salt. They show photos of their families. In that moment, ideology died. It is impossible to hate a man who helps you save your harvest. This situation created the greatest irony of World War II. German soldiers were harvesting crops with their own hands that went into producing rations for the U.S. Army. They canned tomatoes, beans, and meat. These cans were loaded onto ships and sent to Europe. It turned out that the Wehrmacht was literally feeding the American army that was destroying it. Soldiers of the Afrika Korps, without knowing it, were driving nails into the coffin of the Third Reich, helping the enemy economy run without glitches. Many prisoners later recalled this time as the best in their lives. They were fed. They had work. They were treated like human beings. Some farmers even offered to sponsor their immigration after the war. It seemed that the war remained somewhere far away, on another planet. But reality has a way of reminding you of itself. And the idyll of farm lunches shattered into pieces when the projectors were turned on in the camps. In the spring of 1945, the mood in the camps changed. News from the front could no longer be ignored. The Reich was shrinking like shagreen leather. But even then, behind barbed wire in Oklahoma, many Germans held on to the last myth. We are soldiers. We fought honorably. The atrocities of the SS do not concern us. American command decided to destroy this myth too. Mandatory film screenings were introduced in the camps. Attendance, 100% of personnel. Guards with batons stood at the exits so no one dared turn away or close their eyes. At first, the prisoners thought it was just another American propaganda piece. Here, look how well they live in Detroit. They were ready to yawn and smirk. But the projector whirred, and frames shot by U.S. Army cameramen just a few weeks ago appeared on the white sheet. These were not parades and not factories. These were Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf. General Eisenhower, having seen the concentration camps personally, ordered every inch of the horror to be filmed. He said, "Get it all on record now. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." The prisoners saw mountains of emaciated bodies. They saw gas chambers. They saw lampshades made of human skin and crematorium ovens where bones still lay. The first reaction was denial. In dark halls across America, whispers broke out, "This is Hollywood. These are wax dolls. These are special effects. Germans couldn't do this." And then a moment happened that broke everything. In one of the camps, when an American bulldozer on the screen was shoveling hundreds of corpses into a mass grave, a nervous chuckle rang out. Someone couldn't handle the tension. The American officer immediately stopped the film. The lights came on. He walked onto the stage and said, "You're laughing? You think this is a trick? Your fathers and brothers did this, and you are responsible for it." Silence hung in the hall, so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. This was the end of the noble Wehrmacht. For the first time, these well-fed, healthy guys, fattened on American bacon, saw the price of their ideology. They realized that while they were here complaining about tasteless chocolate, their country had turned murder into an industrial assembly line. Many walked out of the barrack theaters and vomited. Others cried. A third group fell into aggressive silence. One prisoner, a former Hitler Youth member, later recalled, "That night I burned my uniform. I burned my medals. I wanted to burn my skin because I was ashamed to be German." The illusion of defenders of Europe crumbled to dust. They saw themselves not as heroes, but as accomplices to the greatest crime in history. And the most terrible realization was that all this time they had been living in paradise, while their nation built hell. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended, Germany capitulated. But for the prisoners in America, this meant a new problem. Their sweet life was coming to an end. The U.S. no longer needed them. The law required them to return home. But home, where was that? In 1946, the repatriation operation began. For most prisoners of war in history, returning home is a celebration. For Germans leaving America, it was an expulsion from paradise back to hell. They packed their duffel bags, and the contents of these bags spoke of U.S. victory more than any flag over the Reichstag. They were not carrying trophies. They were carrying soap, toothpaste, nylon stockings for their wives, jars of instant coffee, and cartons of cigarettes. They were carrying pieces of the American dream to a country where the very concept of a dream had ceased to exist. The ships crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction, and here history came full circle. 3 years ago, they sailed to America expecting to see ruins, but saw shining skyscrapers. Now they sailed home hoping to see something familiar, but saw a lunar landscape. Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Dresden. These were not cities. These were geographic coordinates piled with broken brick. The train taking them home was no longer a comfortable express with soft seats. It was those same dirty cattle cars, frozen through, and outside the window, there were no longer endless fields of wheat and fat herds. There were only skeletons of buildings and the gray faces of people digging through trash. The reunion with families became the final, most brutal psychological blow. Picture this scene. A former prisoner steps onto the platform. He is wearing a new American jacket. He is clean-shaven. He has a healthy complexion. He has spent the last 2 years eating meat, drinking milk, and playing soccer on weekends. And walking towards him are his wife and children, emaciated, pale, dressed in rags, looking like ghosts. They had survived bombings, starvation, and the humiliation of occupation. In that moment, German men felt not joy, but a burning, unbearable shame. Shame that they were full while their families were dying. Shame that captivity with the enemy turned out to be the safest place on earth. America followed on their heels, even here, amidst the ruins. In destroyed Germany, the Reichsmark wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. The new currency became the American cigarette. Former prisoners, who brought supplies from camp stores, suddenly found themselves rich. For a carton of cigarettes, you could hire a crew of workers to clear the rubble of a house. For a couple of packs, you could buy antiques. For one cigarette, get bread. It was the final demonstration of power. Even the trash of the American economy, tobacco and nylon, was worth more than the entire legacy of the 1,000-year Reich. One former Wehrmacht soldier wrote, "In Texas, I realized we lost the war. In Berlin, I realized we lost the future. We watched American Jeeps driving through our streets and understood. These people didn't just defeat us. They bought us, digested us, and spit us out. They stood amidst the ruins, clutching cans of American stew, and finally realized the full scale of the stupidity Hitler had committed. He had declared war not just on a country. He had declared war on an infinite resource. When historians talk about World War II, they draw maps. They draw arrows of offensives on Omaha Beach, in the Ardennes, and at the Kursk salient. They count the number of divisions, Tiger tanks, and Mustang planes. This is the history of battles. But the story we told today is the story of something deeper. It is the story of the collision of two realities. Hitler built his ideology on the concept of triumph of the will. He believed that spirit, fanaticism, and racial purity could overcome the laws of physics and economics. He instilled in millions of Germans that if they wanted victory badly enough, they would win. America answered this with the triumph of logistics. The experience of 371,000 prisoners of war proved that fanaticism is powerless against the assembly line. You can be the bravest soldier in the world. You can be a Superman from propaganda posters. But if your enemy can deliver a hot turkey and a fresh newspaper to a camp 5,000 miles from the front, while you can't find gasoline for your tank, you have already lost. The U.S. broke the Wehrmacht not just with fire. They broke it by showing an alternative. German soldiers expected to see an enemy in America that needed to be destroyed. Instead, they saw a future they wanted to be a part of. Many of those who returned to the ruins of Germany in 1946 became the architects of the German economic miracle. They built a new, democratic Germany with the image of those American factories and farms in their minds. They learned the lesson. A nation's greatness is measured not by the amount of captured land, but by the amount of bread on the table and cars in the garage. This was perhaps the strangest paradox of that war. America didn't just capture the enemy's army. It fed it, clothed it, showed it movies, and sent it home. And in doing so, it turned hundreds of thousands of convinced Nazis into the most reliable witnesses of American power. General Dwight Eisenhower once said, "You cannot defeat an idea with bullets." He was right. To kill the idea of fascism, something more was needed. It took the endless railroads of Texas. It took the smoking chimneys of Detroit. And it took a simple lunch at a farm in Iowa, where enemies broke bread and realized they were just men. Nazism was defeated not only by the heroism of soldiers at the front, it was crushed by the weight of American abundance. And when the last ship with prisoners departed from the pier of New York, taking them to Europe, they took with them Hitler's main defeat, the knowledge that freedom works better than tyranny.